Hi, I'm James Taylor.
And I'm Alison Burns.
And together we are
the Ethical Futurists.
Now, you're listening to the Ethical Futurists podcast, where we dive into the world of sustainability, ethics, and why these ideas today are more important than ever before. Now, join us as we engage with leading thinkers, with business leaders, with academics, with entrepreneurs, with investors, and change makers to uncover the latest ideas shaping a more ethical and sustainable future. We're going to be covering a lot of different things in this podcast as well.
We are indeed. From sustainability, innovation, to future trends and ESG.
Our conversations span a wide array of topics, including renewable energy. We're going to be looking at clean tech, ethical investing,
food systems, and much more.
Yeah. In each episode, we explore really crucial issues such as carbon emissions, the circular economy. We're going to be talking about rewilding,
net zero carbon goals,
and the future of food and energy, something that Alison and I are really passionate about.
So whether you're interested in lab-grown meat, alternative proteins, sustainable finance, or climate-related risk, we've got you covered. Are you looking to secure a keynote speaker who's well-versed in sustainability, ESG, or any of the engaging topics featured on the Ethical Futurists podcast? Well, look no further. Connect with the experts at MENA Speakers to book your ideal speaker today.
Just go to MENA-speakers.com. That's MENA-speakers.com. Alternatively, you can drop them an email at book@MENA-speakers.com to book the perfect speaker for your next event. Daniel Gribbin is the Sustainability and Climate Growth Lead and ESG Risk Advisory Lead at Deloitte Middle East. He is an ESG and sustainability advisory expert with extensive experience across Australia, South America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East in sectors including construction, natural resources, transport, food and beverage, government, financial services, and manufacturing. In 2021, Daniel was ranked as one of the top 20 sustainable MENA real estate professionals here in the Middle East by Cityscape MENA, and in 2022 was named as one of the most influential ESG leaders in the Middle East. Daniel joined Deloitte from the industry, where he was the Chief Operating Officer and Head of Sustainability and ESG. And prior to this, he led ESG teams in the Middle East at both the Big Four and WSP. And it's our great pleasure to welcome Daniel Gribbin on the show today. Welcome, Daniel.
Welcome,
Thank
Daniel.
you, James. Thank you, Alison.
So share with us what's going on in your world just now. What currently has your focus?
Look, it's very busy, I think, as you can tell, with all the activity and everything that's happening around the world. So, I think, to be honest here, that the MENA region as a whole was probably a little bit behind where Europe, North America, Asia is in terms of their response to sustainability and how they were going to manage that. So what we've seen, I've now been in the region for 6 years, is in the last 18 months, a really big uptick in how companies are trying to manage this. We've seen, big conversations happening at CEO levels, at board levels, culminating in COP last year in Dubai, that are starting to, create a lot of action. The UAE having another year of sustainability, I think, is really big in terms of the emphasis it's putting on the need for change. So for us in the Deloitte world, that's clearly creating a lot of activity. We are trying to activate across our various service lines. So whether that's our audit and assurance service line, our risk or our tax offerings, how we actually respond to this and how we mobilise our own people, how we work with our colleagues in Europe to really bring the best of Deloitte and the best of our resources to the solution. That's really probably what's keeping me busiest at the moment, as we sort of go on this growth journey with our clients as well.
Lot going on.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on.
It's a huge opportunity here in this region, absolutely. But today, what would you say are your top 3 accomplishments in your career so far?
Look, I mean, coming from Australia, we were one of the early movers, having a big ER&I and mining sort of sector there. So in 2012-13, we were one of the first to have a carbon tax, and I still rue the Prime Minister for calling it a tax at the time. But we were one of the first to have a carbon tax. And as a result of that, we got to work with some of the largest companies in the world, your likes of BHP and Rio Tinto and others, around how they actually measured greenhouse gas, how they actually monetized and brought in things like shadow carbon pricing and things like this so that they could actually manage the tax properly. And the feedback we got at the time was, this is great. The government's actually set a regulation that we can adhere to. But then, of course, as the way politics work, 2-3 years later, they rolled that back and it was gone. So there was a lot of uncertainty again. But I think that 2-3 year period where we had a lot of clarity from government was a really good thing. And it was really good for me. I visited, a large number of mine sites, helped them start to understand their impact. That was really key. I think one of the other sides for me is some of the digital tools that we're starting to bring out. So the likes of our green light solution at Deloitte was developed again by our Australian team for the mining and metals industry, but it really helps them to quantify greenhouse gas, which there are a lot of solutions out there that do that. But then not only that, start to help them abate and what sort of abatement mechanisms they can bring in and plan their net zero journey. And it offers up to 200 different pathways that are all accredited under SBTI and various other frameworks. And that was a really cool and innovative solution that we have, and we're starting to bring that to our clients here in the Middle East. And I can see that as a really big growth opportunity and pathway for us, and something I'm very excited about. And then lastly, I think one of our biggest accomplishments, particularly at Deloitte, is our zero clause, which is clause 0, which goes into all our contracts now. It was released last year, and it's a clause which actually puts pen to paper in terms of a contractual perspective around what it means for our clients to be acting in a responsible manner from a climate change perspective. So it starts to, ask questions of our contracting departments around how they're managing climate change. It gives Deloitte an opportunity to exit a potential contract where we see our customer not working in a sustainable manner or not operating the way that they should be. And it's a really tangible way that we can sort of, engage with our clients, engage with our customers, even if it's not a sustainability related contract. It could be as simple as a financial audit. It goes in and it opens the door and has a conversation. So it's something that, really new here in the Middle East, something they've been doing in Europe for a little bit, but something I think we're really proud of and really proud to be rolling out here.
I think we're fans of climate change clauses.
Yeah, Alison being a lawyer as well, so she's.
But also as well, we've started to put them into our own contracts, and and people are sometimes taken aback and they're surprised. But actually, if it moves the needle in terms of the conversation, I think that's got to be a good thing. You just get a little bit of pushback. Have you found that?
Yeah, no, I don't think at the moment we're probably not getting pushback, and there's probably a gap, I think, in the education awareness levels, of course. So people, particularly on the legal side, look at it, they don't think it's maybe much of an impact at this point in time in our region. I think in Europe there's a little bit more conversation that's happening. The big four do work a lot with, your likes of Shell and others, and we have a role to play in the transition to the low carbon economy going forward. So we need to make sure we're doing that in a sustainable manner. And we also, from a greenwashing perspective, we want to make sure we're actually doing it in the right way as well. So, it's not so much pushback, but it is certainly creating, I think, key conversations and moving the dial a little bit.
That's got to be good.
Yeah.
Now, part of the role of the work you do at Risk Advisory is helping your clients understand the regulatory environment they're having to operate in. Now, what are the regulatory requirements here in the region when it comes to sustainability and ESG?
Yeah, there's not a large amount at the moment, and we know our region is really driven by regulation. We can see we don't have a big capital market in the way that we do in Europe or in North America. So regulation is really key for us. There are some voluntary requirements that come out through the likes of Dubai Financial Markets or Abu Dhabi Stock Exchange or Tadawul. They are strongly enforced, and it is emphasised that companies comply with them, but they're not mandatory. We see some listing requirements start to come through them as well. So, there are relatively new requirements, for example, on the Dubai Stock Exchange about having female board members and increasing your transparency levels and things of that nature that are starting to move the dial. We've seen Oman, Bahrain, others start to come out with, again, requirements for listed companies around sustainability reporting and disclosure. But I think the big one that's coming for us is the IFRS, ISSB requirements. There is a working group within Saudi Arabia. There is a working group here in the UAE, understanding the implications of it and trying to get the rollout. There is an expectation, of course, that the large entities, the likes of SABIC or Aramco, will be first to comply with these. And so they are looking at them. And that's sort of driving a lot of activity particularly internally. There may not be much you can see externally at the moment, but people are trying to get their house in order in terms of how do we actually get sustainability data to a level that can be reported publicly to the same level of rigor as a financial statement. And so, how do we have the right control environment to do that? And so whilst these regulations may not be actually enforced yet, because we're still waiting for that to be embedded by each country, there is a lot of behind the scene work that is happening and needs to happen by every company to ensure that you get that level of comfort, because your auditor at some stage will come looking at it. The other one is really that affecting a lot of clients here is the CBAM, the carbon border abatement mechanism in Europe, which is effectively taxing goods that come into Europe based on their carbon footprint, and that's affecting a lot of suppliers. I'll use Subic for example, or Aramco, that export their product into European markets. So we're starting to see a lot more questions around how do we comply with this? What do we need to do within our own systems to make sure that we've measured our greenhouse gas footprint appropriately, etc. That is sort of starting to drive a bit more activity there as well.
Yeah, that's good. But how do companies going from big goal aspirations to measurable actions and the implementation of sustainability programs?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of the challenge people have with sustainability is trying to chunk it down. It is, when you talk to someone about the future of humanity or the future of this world, it almost seems like a too big problem. How can I impact that? How can I sort of affect it going forward? And that's no different to a corporation as well. So they're sort of looking at each other going, I'm only one company. How am I going to move the needle on climate change or biodiversity or whatever it might be? So I think for companies, it's really important to, one, think strategically about it. So how does it actually interlink with your corporate strategic position? How does it link with, your duty to investors who are starting to ask questions on this? How does it work with your customers at one level? So you actually get that understanding at your executive and your management level first, and then start to chunk it down a little bit and actually bring this into smaller bite-sized pieces. So, things like net zero commitments at the moment, we're seeing a lot of companies here in the Middle East commit to net zero without actually understanding the building blocks that need to go into getting to net zero. The data, what are the little pieces that I need to do? So having that top down and that bottom up approach, I think, to this topic of sustainability is really key. There's also a lot of other things that we need to do right in the region from a hygiene perspective. So whether that's diversity, health and safety, worker rights, some of these other topics that, we also need to make sure we have that sort of in order before we even start to tackle climate change to a perspective. And I think that also can't be ignored at the same time as we sort of go forward and companies start to get their head around this and start to measure and get data and then actually mitigate and reduce impact.
Great. Now, just to be transparent, Deloitte is one of our clients, because we have spoken at the Deloitte ESG Summit in Washington, D.C. last year. Great event. Had a lot of chief audit officers, chief financial officers, chief sustainability officers there as well. And that focus on that particular event was around disclosure. And the importance of the changes that are going on in disclosure, especially in the US markets, the SEC, and in UK and Europe as well. In this region, what is going on around kind of disclosure requirements? Yeah,
I sort of similar to what I had before, but there's not a lot really. There's a lot of talk, particularly at a government level, at a central banking level, at the stock exchange level around disclosure, particularly with the IFRS requirements, so the ISSB S1 and S2 requirements, which are leveraged off the back of the TCFD. There's a lot of acronyms coming out, I know. But that's sort of the key one that companies are looking at the moment. We are, in our region, probably not going to be as affected by the likes of the European reporting requirements, the CSRD. The SEC ruling as well was quite watered down in terms of the use of subsidiaries and sort of remote offices and things like that. But I think one thing I encourage companies to do is actually look at this reporting landscape. Too often we wait until the regulation comes and it's a very last minute knee-jerk response by organisations to comply. And if this comes particularly from an IFRS, ISSB perspective, it will become part of your auditor's remit. And as soon as that happens, you've got the opportunity for an adverse opinion or something to occur there which can affect your, credit ratings, your various other things that happen with, adverse opinions there. So I really encourage companies to actually have a strategic look at all these regulations, go through almost a mapping process to go, okay, in FY 28, 29, when CSRD becomes active, for subsidiary clients, do we have an operating company that may be picked up by that? How do we need to set up our organisation properly from a legal entity perspective to actually comply with the various reporting requirements? I expect the region to adopt something like an IFRS sometime soon, but in terms of timeframes, I think we still have a bit of gap between the collection of data. The government and the regulators know this. We need better data. We need more robust data, and we need that to be disclosed. And then we also need a really healthy audit environment to make sure that we got a level of auditability of that. That
was something we noticed at that event in Washington when there was the big ideas, the big targets by the Chief Sustainability Officer, the Chief Executive Officer, and then you had the Chief Audit Officer putting a hand up going, we do not have the data for this. We're not collecting it. So sooner rather than later. Alison, I'll hand over to you.
Yep. Well, my next question is, what's the hardest part of your job? But I would imagine that the degrees of that have changed since you've been in this region.
Yeah, they definitely have. I think the hardest part, I've been fortunate enough to do sustainability now for 16 years in Australia, which was quite a developed market at the time, and then into places like the Netherlands where we had a very big social conscience, and now the Middle East, which is really just starting on this journey, I suppose. The biggest challenges we've often faced is the mismatch in expectations and levels of awareness. So when talking with clients, often they think of it as perhaps a cost plus rather than a value add. They think it's an extremely expensive program and then they don't even want to start. Or conversely, they think it's a very easy and cheap fix that they can do to make themselves more, quote unquote, sustainable. Yeah. So there is often a mismatch between them about how we actually, create that change, create that lever to differentiate themselves and build them up. I think, for us, that requires a completely different skill set than we're probably used to in traditional consulting. It's not just writing a PowerPoint or, creating a strategy or something like that. There's actual people involved, and you need to really bridge that gap in order to make the change and going forward. So that's probably been the biggest challenge, I think, over my career, and particularly now here in the Middle East.
Yeah, but you're bringing all that expertise with you.
Yeah.
But it's a different. The goalposts are sitting slightly differently now.
Correct.
But it's a challenge, but. Yeah. You're facing it.
And in this journey, you've talked about this from Australia, Netherlands, here now in the region as well. Was there maybe a key aha moment that you had on this journey yourself?
Yeah, I think I touched on it a little bit there, but I think it was for me realising it's not as much about perhaps the technical competencies. So it's not as much about having the perfect answer every time, but more about the behavioural change and how do we actually psychologically create change. And I've had this debate numerous times within organisations, with my own leaders. Are we better to create 1% of change or 0% of change, particularly in a topic like sustainability, where any change is generally for the positive as a rule of thumb, not necessarily all the times because of the unintended consequences. But, if we get one person to put one cup in a recycling bin, is that better than no one putting a cup in a recycling bin? So that behavioural change element is key. And I think that was the aha moment, which I sort of had, particularly coming to the Middle East. So making that one person go, ooh, I can do a little bit of difference here. And then ideally what we want to do is clearly make that person the leader of the organisation. So if we get a chairman or a CEO having that aha moment, that's when we start to really make, that monumental change, which is really key going forward. So that for me was a big one, that you didn't have to have the perfect technical answer. What you had to do is create change and create momentum through sort of behaviour and through culture.
And the Big Four, because you touch so many different types of industries, so many different types of clients as well, you have that ability, if you choose to, that mantle you could choose to take if you want to do that. Quick fire round as we start to finish up here as well.
Is there a book that you can recommend or point our listeners to that you particularly find inspiring, or it's through the sustainability or any other issue that you?
Yeah, the one that springs to mind, which is, I must say, full disclosure, I'm a very big Harry Potter fan. But
she lives quite close to us in Scotland.
But no, the one that made an impact on me, and I always forget the name of it, but it was about the New Zealand rugby team, where they talked about sweeping the sheds and they talked about team culture. And if you look at the All Blacks, they're one of the most successful teams of all time. Yep. I think they've got something like an 80% winning record or something to that effect. And the next highest is someone like the Yankees or the Lakers, which have about a 58% winning record. So that book really taught me a lot about how you create culture, how your leadership style should work and impact. And I wish I could remember the name of it, but I haven't read it in about 10 years or so. But for me, that was probably the biggest one that I enjoyed.
Great. And we'll put that on the show notes here for this episode. And we'll also put it in if you go to theethicalfuturist.com/books, we'll have a list of all the books recommended by our guests here as well. We're big fans of podcasts here on The Ethical Futurist. Is there a podcast you like to listen to?
Yeah, so I like listening to The Daily, so the New York News. That's probably my go-to to get my little snippet of the world. I think, clearly here in the Middle East, we're probably a little bit sheltered from what's happening outside our four walls. So that's probably my go-to at the moment. It's, getting a bit of the information around, particularly what's happening in the US, what's happening outside it. That's probably the one I go to the most, aside from I'm a big fan of some of the comedy podcasts and things like that out there. So there's a couple from Australia that I listen to for a bit of light relief, but that's probably the more serious one.
Great. Well, you alluded to sustainability earlier in inverted commas, and it's a word that is, I think, now is used a lot, and it almost feels as if it's an off-the-cuff throwaway word that really doesn't have the true weight and responsibility wrapped up in it. Do you think that people truly understand what the meaning of that and what that means for the planet and how we, as human beings on the planet, operate? And with that in mind, what does an ethical and sustainable future look like for you?
Yeah, I think to answer your first part, no, to put it frankly. When I first started working in sustainability 16 years ago, my friends would often, make fun jokes that I was, sort of the pixie at the end of the garden or something to that effect. But, they've started to come around to it, particularly those who are in probably more energy-intensive industries. But I still have conversations on a daily basis with people not understanding what sustainability is, what, companies need to do, how they can actually make an impact. And for me, that comes to, I think, the second point. I've got two young boys, and that's really, the definition of sustainable development back from, the Brundtland report back in the days of, meeting the needs of the future without compromising the needs of today. And so I look at those boys and I go, I want them to have a world in which, they don't need to worry about the term sustainability, where they don't need to worry about polar caps melting or, various other extreme weather events and things like that. So, I want them to have that future. And for me, that's what this comes down to, is sustainability. I think there is still a big mismatch, a big education and awareness thing. I think there's very important that we have these other rules that are coming out in Europe, such as anti-greenwashing. And, we're seeing people start to get put into parliament to help governments understand this. We're seeing boards overthrown. So there's a big movement that's happening there. But I think on a sort of the everyday mum and dad, we still have a bit of a mismatch there around what does sustainability mean. We do see a lot of CEOs throw it in their speeches or in their strategies, but not actually know how to live and breathe that going forward.
Great.
You're basically getting rid of your own job.
Yeah, So I've said this to many clients. My role as a consultant is to put myself out of a job. As a sustainability consultant, it's not sustainable to use consultants at the end of the day. So I've said this to many clients, saying, ideally in 20 years, you don't need a consultant. You don't need someone like me to come in and talk to you. You do this yourselves, and it's part of your DNA, and it's part of who you are. And for me, that would be a perfect world where, sustainability is part of an auditor's job and part of a financial controller's job. And, we don't even think about it. We just act in the appropriate manner.
Well, until that point, you've got a few years left, probably. Where's the best place for people to go and learn more about the work you're doing, what Deloitte is doing? You mentioned Greenlight and some of these other programs.
Yeah, so Deloitte.com is our website. You can find that on all the various search engines and things like that as well. My LinkedIn as well, very active there, trying to promote our activities that we do. And, through that, we've got a lot of programs. Please reach out if you want to hear about them. But we run programs with our European colleagues on upcoming technologies, on impacts in the boardroom, on various other things that are facing the world. And, we love to get that community up and engaged and help them going forward as well.
Well, Daniel Gribbin, it's been a great pleasure having you as our guest today on the Ethical Futurist podcast.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you.
If you're considering making sustainability or ESG one of the themes for your next conference, your event, or perhaps a company retreat, then why not invite Alison and myself to be your keynote speakers or event MCs? We've delivered really inspiring co-keynote programs for some of the world's largest organizations from all different kinds of industries. Now, the Ethical Futurist keynote will take your audience on a journey to discover how the world's most ethical and sustainable companies are really innovating in their industries. So if you'd like to learn more about booking Alison and I as the Ethical Futurist for your next event, then simply head to theethicalfuturists.com/speaking. That's theethicalfuturists.com/speaking to schedule a call to discuss with us. We're delighted that you listened to this podcast, and we'd really thank you if you could just take a moment now to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Also, while you're there, why not give us a 5-star rating and leave us a review? It would really mean a lot to Alison and I. So from me, James Taylor.
And me, Alison Burns.
Thanks for listening to the Ethical Futurist podcast.